Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on The Finals. This is a first-person shooter developed by Embark Studios, which is made up of former DICE developers. And even though the Steam page doesn't say it, the game is published by Nexon. And while it's been in various forms of beta over the past couple of years, it finally got its full release yesterday as I'm recording this video. Now, I didn't mess around with any of those betas. I'm going into this fresh with the full release. And the only thing I really know about the game prior to this is that it was hyped to all hell. All throughout its development and all the playtests that were available, pretty much every single influencer, as they're called these days, or YouTube creators, or whatever you want to call them, were constantly hyping this thing up to be the next revelation in first-person shooter gaming. Like, it was going to completely change the way we look at first-person shooters. It was going to be the new standard by which all first-person shooters are measured, or some nonsense like that. This was supposed to be because of the game's destruction engine. You were able to destroy an awful lot of the environment, much like you could in the likes of Red Faction Guerrilla, which is certainly cool, don't get me wrong, but I know that a feature like that is only a gimmick if the rest of the game doesn't hold up. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Well, it's a first-person shooter where you play as one of 3 different classes, light, medium, or heavy, each of which has a special ability, as well as its own selection of weapons. They do also have a selection of gadgets that are things like grenades or landmines and things like that are shared between all of them, and you just swap them in and out of your loadout with whatever you feel like using. The special abilities are as follows. The light class gets a grappling hook, or an evasive dash, or a cloaking device. The medium class gets either a healing beam, an auto turret, or a sensory ability that allows you to see enemies through walls for a brief period. And the heavy gets a choice of either a charging ability that allows you to just rush forward and break through walls and slam into the ground and things like that, or a goo gun, which allows you to shoot out blobs of goo that will harden into effectively walls, or they get a bubble shield. As you might expect, the light class has the least health but the fastest movement, while the heavy class has the slowest movement but the most health. The heavy also gets access to some heavier weapons like machine guns, a sledgehammer, flamethrower, as well as an RPG, which is a gadget technically, but it's only available to the heavy class. The light class has access to submachine guns, a light suppressed pistol, a sniper rifle, battle rifle, and even a sword. And then the medium class is kind of in the middle. It gets access to a lever-action shotgun, an AKM, a SCAR, a grenade launcher, and a Magnum revolver. And once you've got your loadout set to your heart's content, then you jump into one of the game's 3 game modes, which are Quick Cache, Bank It, and Tournament. In the Quick Cache mode, you and your 2 squad mates are competing against 2 other teams of 3 to reach the cache goal in the allotted time, and in order to do that, you need to go and find vaults, open those up, take the box from the vault and bring it over to a cache-out station, and then once you've got it at the cache-out station, it goes on a timer until eventually the timer expires and it caches out to whoever happens to control that cache-out station when the timer expires. This, of course, means that you have to do one of 2 things in order to secure the cache-out. Either you have to get the vault, get the thing from the vault to the cache-out station, and then hold that cache-out station for the entire length of time, or, much more commonly, you're going to wait for someone else to start the cache-out sequence, and then once the timer is going for a while, you wait until the team that is currently controlling the cache-out station gets wiped out or diminished, and then you just swoop in, wipe them out, take the cache-out station for yourself, and then laugh as you steal that team's points away from them and render all of their efforts void. In case you can't tell by the tone of my voice, not only is that extremely irritating, but it's also the way that basically any quick cache match is going to go. So what about the other 2 modes? Well, the second mode is called Bank It, and the idea there is that you're either trying to hit the cache goal, or you have the most cash for your team when the timer expires, and the way you go about getting cash in that is similar to what you saw with the quick cash mode, except that there's no waiting for the cash out station to process the cash out. Instead, when you open a vault, it drops a bunch of coins on the ground, and then you can pick those up and take them to a cash out station and then just deposit them directly, or you can eliminate other players and get a small amount of coins from them, or steal the coins that they happen to be carrying and then go cash out for a much larger amount. But you have to be careful there, because once you start getting a high enough level of cash, the game will start highlighting you as a very juicy target for the other players to go after. And unlike with the quick cash mode where it's 3v3v3, in the bank it mode it's 3v3v3v3, so you have 4 teams instead of 3 teams. So it ends up being noticeably more hectic. The third mode is tournament, where you have a lot of teams all competing in a bracket, and you have 2 knockout rounds before you get to the final round, and the winner of the final round is the winner of that so-called tournament. And if you're looking for ranked play, that's going to be in the tournament section. You have to play an awful lot of casual matches before you can unlock the ability to play the ranked mode, but the only ranked play available is the tournament mode. As for the gameplay mechanics of the tournament, it's quick cash, except with 4 teams of 3 instead of 3 teams of 3 like the normal quick play version of quick cash is. So the actual reality of the situation is not that you have 3 modes, it's that you have 2 modes and then another mode that is just a spin on one of the previous modes. Now, regardless of which of these modes you're playing, the match is going to take place on one of 4 maps, and there are absolutely no big team modes like you would expect from the Battlefield developers. It's all only 3v however many other teams of 3 there are. So, how does it all work out? Well, I do want to mention that there are a few odd technical issues here and there. I ran into a couple of crashes, which were just kind of out of nowhere, and I'm not really sure what caused them. Sometimes the netcode can be a bit wonky with regards to hit registration, where you might think that you're behind a wall, and everything that you see on your end shows that you're behind the wall, but you still take a hit anyway, which is certainly a fairly common problem with first-person shooter netcode, so it's not like the finals is unique in this regard, but it is worth mentioning that it does happen occasionally. And of course there are occasional issues with the physics or the destruction glitching out a bit, although it's usually never anything all that serious. So now that we've got technical problems out of the way, what about the actual gameplay itself, whether it be the modes themselves, the way the maps flow, the way the gunplay is? How does all that work out? Well, you'll see in stuff like the Steam reviews, a lot of people are complaining about the movement. Apparently, during beta, the movement was much faster and smoother, and the parkour element of it was much better. Meanwhile, the developers said that they didn't make any actual changes to the movement. The main difference is that the FOV defaults to a lower value than it did during the beta, so you just need to bump that back up to whatever you had it to before. And in my particular case, I just jumped in with an FOV of 100, because I always go into my options and bump up the FOV to about 100 to 105, depending on the game. And while I certainly can't speak for how the movement was during beta, I can tell you that in its current state, it's fine. It's relatively fast. It's not the fastest I've ever seen. It's certainly not the likes of Quake. But in terms of being a first-person shooter that is in the same vein of general gameplay mechanics as stuff like Call of Duty and Battlefield, the movement is fine. You've got a sprint, you've got jumping, you can slide, and there's a variety of ways to get yourself up to higher elevation. Either you can just jump up and climb on things, or you can use the jump pads, or you can use the ropes and ascend on them. And it's relatively fast-paced, although a lot of that does also depend on which class you're playing. If you look at the light class versus the heavy class, the difference there is pretty stark. Lights are much, much faster and much more nimble than the heavies are, although heavies are still relatively nimble, it's just that they move slower. The only thing I can really figure is that the people really complaining about the movement are either people who just paid absolutely no attention to the FOV slider, or the kind of players that give you a migraine to watch because they're constantly jumping around and sliding all over the place and doing the slide canceling and such like that, and really need to lay off the energy drinks. Anyway, regardless of the reality of the movement, like I said, it's fine for what it is. It's nothing all that special, though. And the main interesting parts of the game are going to come from the destructibility of the environments as well as the various environmental hazards and options you have. There are jump pads scattered around the map so you can very quickly go from a lower elevation to a much higher one. There are a lot of ropes that you can ascend on. On certain maps, there are even moving platforms that you can hop onto, or things that are suspended from the sky, and that can get fairly interesting to navigate. But it gets more interesting when you start factoring in the boxes that are suspended in the sky, and you can shoot them to spawn a whole bunch of various throwable items, whether it be gas canisters that you can throw that will spawn a toxic cloud of gas, or canisters that will explode when you launch them at things, or canisters that will spread a large amount of the goo everywhere, which of course turns into hardened walls, or ones that will douse a large area in flames, or even ones that will just spew out a whole bunch of smoke. These all combine with the destructibility of the environments to produce a very dynamic arena setting, where even though there are only 4 maps, the amount of alterations you can make by just having a battle and blasting chunks out of the environment and such makes fighting on these maps much more interesting. It's just a shame that that's pretty much all the game actually has going for it. You see, because all of the game modes in this are 3v, 3v3, or 3v3v3v3, you are paired up with 2 randos, who may or may not communicate with you at all, and may or may not work with you as a team. Obviously, you can mitigate this problem by playing with 2 of your buddies, but then you run into the same problem that I have with any game where somebody says, oh, well, this game's fun with friends. I made an entire video about that. I will link it in the card thing that pops up and in the video description if you're curious. And as much as I'm sure proponents of this game will tell you that it's all about player skill and that I have a skill issue or something like that, there's very little someone can do against an onslaught of 2 or even 3 full teams of other players coming after you because you're the one that has the cash at the moment. The thing is, even if you are put in a squad with people who do communicate with you and do work with you as a team, you still have to contend with the mediocre at best gunplay and the rather annoying balancing problems the game has. And this comes in a few flavors. The first of them is that as a free-to-play game with an unlock system that relies on you earning currency by playing to be able to purchase weapons and gadgets and such, you have the inherent imbalancing problem of people who have played the game longer simply have access to more weapons, more gadgets and such, and thus are better equipped than you, regardless of whether they're actually any better at the game than you or not. This is particularly frustrating because certain weapons that you have to unlock are just flat out better than the ones you start with. So even if you are actually a really good player, you're still going to be at a pretty significant disadvantage until you unlock those particular items. The second flavor of balancing problem is that there is no in-game adjustment for when somebody decides to leave. So for example, if you jump into a match and somebody leaves your team, well, you're down 1 player for the rest of the match. There's nothing you can do about it. But the main flavor of balancing issue has to do with the way the health system works and, of course, how the class system intertwines with that. You see, the TTK, or time to kill in the finals, is actually fairly high. You can take a lot of damage before going down, and you can replenish your health relatively quickly, whether it be by other players in your team healing you up with a healing beam, or just getting away from the fight long enough to regenerate your health automatically. And while the light class has the least amount of health, you can still take quite a few hits as a light before going down. And you can probably already see where I'm going with this, but the simple fact of the matter is that the way the gunplay currently works, with the amount of damage you can take being fairly high, the heavy class is just flat out overpowered right now, because they can take the most hits before going down, and they have some of the more powerful weapons for dealing with the whole you have a lot of health problem, which is light machine guns and the automatic shotgun. This puts them in the most advantageous position out of all of the classes. That's not to say that you can't succeed as a light or a medium, but it is to say you will find the task more daunting, and it becomes pretty obvious very early on that they definitely need to be doing quite a bit of tweaking with regards to the balancing. But even if they manage to sort out the imbalance problem, there is still the problem of the gunplay itself just being mediocre at best. Let's face it, whenever you have a situation where the guns either feel like they're just shooting blanks, or they just feel like pea shooters because the amount of health that enemies have is enough to where they can just tank a lot of damage, you're just going to end up with fairly unsatisfying gameplay, and the finals suffers pretty severely for that. I mean, the game gives the impression that it is supposed to be very fast-paced and frenetic, and yet the combat just doesn't feel as fast or frenetic as it really should, because you can just tank so many hits that it feels like you're going into a tedious slugfest more than anything else. Don't get me wrong, it's not that the gunplay is terrible, it's not the worst I've ever experienced, but it just doesn't feel like it fits the style of game they were going for. They definitely could do with lowering the TTK at the very least just a bit, so that everything is more in line with the fast-paced arcadey experience that they seem to be going for here. Because as it stands, the game actually feels more like it was designed for bigger team play than 3v3v3 or 3v3v3v3. And I can't help but wonder if at a much earlier stage in development, the game actually was designed for larger team battles and they decided to scale everything down to try to chase the esports crowd. The thing is, if they are chasing the esports crowd, then they don't seem to understand how terrible of an idea that is. The esports crowd is minuscule. It is an extreme minority of the gaming space. If you tailor a gameplay experience around what they want, then you're just going to end up alienating the vast majority of the players. Although the game's predatory monetization practices are probably more than enough to do that anyway. The cosmetics that you can get for free require an excessive amount of grinding and frankly aren't very good. Most likely in an attempt to push you into paying for cosmetics, of which the paid cosmetics frankly are all overpriced and don't look very good. Oh, and of course there's a battle pass. It has to have a battle pass. Everything these days has to have a battle pass, and it's full of crappy looking cosmetics too. Look, I get that this is a free-to-play first-person shooter. They have to make their money somewhere, and cosmetics are really the best way you can do that. But in order to make money off of the cosmetics, you have to offer cosmetics that actually look good, that people are willing to pay for, and you have to have a gameplay loop that people are actually going to want to stick around for, and in the game's current state, I really don't see people sticking around for very long. On top of all of the issues I've already mentioned, the game just has a personality problem. All of the dialogue, or not really dialogue so much as the announcers and the various clips that you hear from the player characters and such, were all generated by AI. And you can tell it just doesn't sound natural at all. And the theme of this all taking place in a VR setup as a game show is at least a neat idea, but the execution is just boring. But hey, with it being a game that takes place in VR, at least you can justify the ridiculous cosmetics that I'm sure they'll eventually start adding that completely destroy any sense of artistic integrity like we see with Call of Duty these days. But that's really not saying much. And you know what the really weird thing about all this is? The game reminds me an awful lot of that Ubisoft Battle Royale game from a few years ago called Hyperscape that was covered pretty widely early on and then just dropped off of a cliff almost immediately and ended up getting shut down after 2 years. That is the same kind of vibe I get from the finals, and that is not a vibe you want your game to have. Will it turn out the same way as Hyperscape though? Who knows? Anything can happen, so for all I know, they'll turn the game around, they'll throw in big team modes, they'll make it an experience worth having, as opposed to just a very gimmicky, small-scale first-person shooter that just isn't very good. We'll just have to wait and see, I guess. But as it stands, I really can't recommend the game in its current state. Obviously, it's free to play, so you're not really losing anything but the bandwidth and storage space if you decide to give it a try. But I'd still say that if you are interested in messing around with the finals, you may want to wait for a few updates down the line to see if they make some improvements. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my channel, please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit does help. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.